So, what about the King James Bible? We've done a very long series on Who Told You Where You Got Your Bible, and we're just going to do two on the King James. And next week we'll talk a little bit more about the King James only controversy. You see, the King James Version, very, very important and influential in the English language and in culture and in law and society since it really was released in 1611. However, there have been some complaints about the King James Version through the years, especially in the last 50 or 60, as language has changed so rapidly, and the King James Version is in an older version of the English language. It's not Old English. In fact, it's really beginning of modern English is where it fits. But it fits there with Shakespeare and John Donne and some other writers that modern English speakers have a hard time reading and understanding without a lot of extra help. I enjoy Shakespeare. However, I would not have enjoyed Shakespeare without a teacher that showed us how to read it and where the humor was and what wordplay was. And it took us a year to get where we could appreciate the Shakespeare plays. An educated person can read the King James Version with help, study guides, and every so often utilizing Google or Bing to look up words. But is that the best way for us to introduce the word? Well, first of all, who is King James? There was a time where Scotland and England were two separate nations. Technically, they are now, but they are within a larger nation called the United Kingdom. At that time, they were separate. They had often intertwined. Their royal families had intermarried. And through a series of events, which are fascinating, but which are beyond the scope of today and our time, King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, because he was their first King James, but we'd had 5 of them before. His mother was murdered by the Queen of England, and yet they were related in such a way that when that queen died, the son of the woman she murdered was next in line for the throne of England and already on the throne in Scotland. So that's how he's the King James I of England and the 6th of Scotland. I hope that wasn't too... Anyway, he was very much a Protestant. Scotland at that time was very Presbyterian. English was very Episcopalian. There were a lot of people in England that were quite worried that he would bring Presbyterianism to their nation. There have been a lot of people killed and jailed over that on both sides of the border, trying to enforce one system upon the other. And this is after a series of hundreds of years where there were wars about Catholic, Protestant, and what religion you were varied according to what monarch was reigning at the time. It's very confusing, very unsettling, not ideal in any way, shape, or form. So King James comes in, and as a fierce believer in God, he was even a fiercer witch hunter, and he wrote a big book on how to find them, torture them, and kill them. Horrible thing. He was not a good man in many, many ways, but he did see a need to get the Bible settled because the Bible was a bit of a mess in the early 1600s. You've been through this long series with me, so you know the Geneva Bible was published, and it did a good job, and it had thousands of notes in it. Well, the Catholics who were currently running England did not like the notes, so they published their own version of the Geneva Bible, which was basically the Geneva Bible stripped without the notes, because the notes really questioned papal authority, the central church, and all of that, and it pushed for more freedom in religion and aided the Protestant cause. Well, the Bishop's Bible didn't have those notes. And the Bishop's Bible at the time was the only Bible that was allowed to be printed in English in England. King James wanted to change that. He wanted to correct the Bishop's Bible. And here's a really important thing to know about the King James Version. People often believe that they went back to the oldest manuscripts that they could find and that this is a brand new translation from old manuscripts. It was not. The King James Version was just a revision of the Bishop's Bible. And in fact, they say so in their foreword. Their foreword says that this rule, the Bishop's Bible, be followed and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. In fact, it goes further. Truly, good Christian reader, we never thought from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, nor yet to make of a bad one a good one, but to make a good one better. Later, one of the translators, Simon Ward, wrote, caution was given that an entirely new version was not to be furnished, but an old version, long received by the church, to be purged from all blemishes and faults. Therefore, the King James Version is best understood as a revision of the 1602 edition of the Bishop's Bible. Carefully looking at the old manuscripts when they had them, they did not have very many, and those they had were not very old. But they were very plainly not trying to make a new translation. This is a problem for the King James only people. We'll talk about that next week. There is a myth that the King James Bible was inspired by God, every word, the revisers and all, and that it has never been changed. And that's just not true. There have been massive revisions to the King James Bible. All the way up there. In fact, if you take a look just at the changes, a list of the changes, there are more than 20 pages of changes that have been made in the first edition change. If you take a look at all the changes that have been made all the way up to about 1796, which is the last major revision, it's over 150 pages of changes. And so once again, it was not considered a new translation, nor was it considered a perfect translation. Recently, a new recount has been made because there was a pastor in North Carolina who claimed that when he listened to, he actually listened to recordings of the first King James and the modern King James, that he heard only 421 changes. Well, that was D.A. Waite, by the way, who claimed that. Well, several people heard that and called foul, and they went back and found over 2,000 changes. So once again, it was never considered to be the authorized version sent by God, never to be changed. It was changed quickly and repeatedly and often. It also was not a new translation and said so repeatedly, as did the revisers and translators themselves in their private communications and their public reports. They did not speak in unison. The idea that they all agreed on every word, not even close. They were divided into 6 companies, 1 Hebrew, 1 Greek, in 3 different places, Westminster, Cambridge, and Oxford. So each one of those 3 places had 2 companies, one working with Hebrew, one with Greek. Then once they worked through theirs, 8 or 9 men worked over selections. Review was to take place among the other companies. Then it was sent into a general meeting. 12 men took control of the general meeting, and they then made revisions in Stationers' Hall in 1610. Several final editors then came after the general meeting and added paratextual material, finishing touches. These men never met in the same room. Not the 6 companies, the 12 men did, but then the revising at the end, these men never all met. They never had open discussions. That is not true. Where differences were made or were discovered, let's say this company really dislikes what this company did with the passage, they weren't brought together to work that out. Rather, that was decided by the 12 men in the general meeting in Scribner's Hall. Once again, once you know about this, you realize the Bible is a living, breathing document, and therefore living, breathing people translated it, and they did it in committees, and sometimes committees didn't even get to meet. But there is a real treasure, a complete treasure for anybody that wants to see this. You can see it at the Bodleian Library. That's in Oxford. We have found in recent years one of the Bibles that was used for people to make notes. And they would make notes, these translators. This is from the Geneva Bible. This is from the Bishop's Bible. This committee thinks this. And they made all of these notes. Well, it has now been digitally scanned and made available at the Oxford Library, but also online. Bodleian Library, Oxford, you would look for the King James Bible. It is completely accessible. You do not have to be a scholar to see it. And you're able to see the notes off to the side. Written down all of the, it was acquired, by the way, in 1646. A large Bible wherein is written down, the spelling back then was interesting, all the alterations of the last translation. Yay, you can actually see how you can sift things. In fact, you can even see where some of the translator's notes got put into the written text and where some of the translator's notes were misunderstood by the printers, so the printers printed something else. It is, you can find this by reading the New Cambridge Paragraph Bible. Once again, I think very few of you would be interested in this, but just to show you the handwritten notes themselves in the Old Testament, there were fewer for the New Testament. Interestingly enough, Lamentations and the Apocrypha, there are no handwritten notes in that. But you will find how they processed and they went through all of this. And there was none of this God spoke and we wrote stuff. They were human beings and they treated each other as human beings with whom they sometimes had disagreements, but were by and large in agreement. We know every part of how this is put together. Alistair McGrath, we would pronounce it McGraw in Scotland, but M-C-G-R-A-T-H, Alistair McGrath, wrote a great book on how the King James came together. There are so many books on how they came together, but it amazes me. I still hear every so often in a sermon or I'll read online how we don't really know how it all came together, but these scholars all met together, then they came out with this book. None of that's true. And historically, it's very easy to show how this all came together. We don't have any kind of data like this on how Shakespeare got his plays down on paper, or which ones are really by Shakespeare and which ones are not. That's still a raging argument. But we have all the data. We've got all of the data for the King James. It is not a literal translation. There have been those that say it's literal. The new ones are paraphrases. King James Version is not literal, was never meant to be literal. It was meant to be beautiful. Here's an example. In Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, it translates one Greek word 3 different ways because one of their tasks was to avoid repetition and boring sentences. So in the King James Bible, Christians rejoice in hope, glory in tribulations, and joy in God. But rejoice, hope, and joy are all the same word. The reason they're rendered differently is to make it read prettier, not literal. It's not Old English, it's early modern English. That was a phrase I was struggling to remember a while ago, which goes on to about 1700. And then you have middle modern English. And today you have modern English, and who knows what they're going to call it whenever we all descend into emojis and 3-letter acronyms, whatever they are. There were those who think that the King James Version was made to pacify Puritans. All right, we've only got a minute. The church in England, the Church of England, was divided into 2 groups. One was kind of Catholic light in their ceremony and their ritual. The other, Puritans, members of the same church, but they eschewed all of the popery that they saw. They didn't want the stained glass. They didn't want the liturgies. They wanted simplicity. And there are those that believe that King James, one of the reasons he had his Bible was to pacify the Puritans. If so, it was a failure because he didn't invite anybody but 4 pretty tame Puritans into his conference to talk about the new translation, about making it. He didn't give the Puritans too much at all here. The Puritans supposedly had 1,000 people sign a petition, pastors, that this Bible needed to support them. Yeah, translate the Bible to support us. Where the other group said, no, translate it to support us. And James went with the Episcopal side, the more liturgical side, than he did the Puritans. It's one of the reasons why Puritans ended up getting in jail sometimes having to leave the country, and sometimes having war overthrowing and bringing in Cromwell. A lot of history there, but at least now you've got the Bible. It was a victory for everybody, but not so much the Puritans. They got some things, but not everything they wanted. And now we got to stop. Because what about those people that say we can only use the King James Version? We need to talk about that. We'll do that next week.